Okay, I think everybody's ready. There are less people here than last week. It was a full classroom, which is of course nice, but now you can follow from at home. They fixed the camera, so normally you should be able to follow on YouTube, but of course I'm also making a screencast in case something goes wrong. So there's always the possibility that the live stream fails, and that's why we also have a screencast, so that you can always have a look at the screencast afterwards. So this is the first contact moment. There are only 3 contact moments for you here at home, for Linux at home. This is the first one, in which I will discuss the organization of this course unit, give you a general introduction to Unix and Linux, and also discuss the installation of Linux on your computer. So I sent you a mail with some general information, especially download links, because this is very important. If you still have to start downloading right now, I should recommend you do so. But normally you should have downloaded already the ISO file, and you can already start downloading the VirtualBox software as well. So let's start with an introduction to the course unit. On the site, the course site on Lego, you can find general information also about the organization of this course unit. You will find different buttons. If there is an announcement, I already posted an announcement, you can find it under announcements. The general information about the organization of the course unit, the different learning goals that will be discussed, but also how the evaluation takes place, can be found here under course unit details. This redirects you to the syllabus part, The syllabus is not an actual syllabus, it's just a summary of which learning goals are covered, how the evaluation takes place, and so on and so on. A general objective is also stated there, but it is not an actual syllabus. If you want to see the course material, you should go to study material. This redirects you to the modules page. And in the modules you will find an overview of the different chapters of the course unit. I added an extra button, the contact moments button, in which we'll find an explanation about the different contact moments. A little bit before every contact moment, I will provide you with some general information regarding that contact moment. For instance, here, state that we'll have a general introduction, and I will give you a demo on the installation of Linux. So after today, Linux should be installed on every computer. Of course, at home I can't help you, but today I can help you if you would have a problem. And that's why this contact moment is there. The presentation that I'm using is also available here, so every contact moment has its own presentation in which I make some kind of summary of the information that I'm telling you. You can also have a look at the different chapters that will be discussed. And then you will see that there's also second and a third contact moment, and also the date of the exam is already stated. And you will find some information concerning the exam here on this page. If I go to the modules section, you can find the link to the study material. So which study material is available. You will see that there is a syllabus available for this course unit. There are also presentations. You can find them with the different modules. So if you look at the different modules, for every chapter, a presentation is available. So you can find these presentations. And there are also some solutions to the test yourself questions that are in the PowerPoints available. These are most of the time some short screencasts, but they will also provide you with some text that explains how to solve some questions. Yeah? Most of the time it is the same exercise that is repeated and repeated again. For this study material, I want to emphasize that I will be focusing for the exam on the PowerPoint presentations, and the syllabus is just some extra information concerning these presentations. So what you actually should study is the PowerPoint presentations, but some more explanation can be found in the syllabus. So I will focus mainly on the PowerPoint presentations. And I think that is important to say to you, so that you know how to study, what to study. Of course, a lot of the presentations is available in the syllabus, but sometimes there is some information in the syllabus that we don't read during the PowerPoint presentations, and then you can skip this kind of information. It's just some general extra information that I provide. What else do we have on the course side is discussions. There are no discussions yet. And this is actually for you. If you have a question and you think this may be a general question that somebody else, maybe a colleague, a student colleague, or that I should answer, but is actually for the whole classroom to hear, you can ask that question here. You can start a discussion and ask the question. There will be some feedback from others, so you can give each other feedback, so you can try to answer the question of your colleague if you know the answer, of course, but also I will have a look at the different questions that are asked and try to solve them, so that everybody knows which questions are asked and which questions are solved. If you have a question that is not for the whole classroom, you can just email me. So you're not obligated to ask that question there. But sometimes we see that this is actually very nice to have these kind of discussions about the course material, about solving some exercises, and you can have a look at that here. So let's start with the first. Start with the general introduction. If you already downloaded VirtualBox, maybe I'll go back to the course site. If you already downloaded VirtualBox, you should start the installation of VirtualBox. So that is already finished before we start the installation of Fedora in VirtualBox. I was a little bit too fast. So what we will discuss today is the installation. And you can find a page here discussing this installation with, how do you say that, some kind of roadmap, in Dutch een stappenplan on how to install Fedora on your system. First of all, we need, of course, software for that. We will install Fedora itself. Normally you should have downloaded Fedora from this download page. It should be a large file, 1.7 gigabyte large. If you downloaded a small file of approximately 20 gigabytes, it's the wrong file. So you should have a look at that. You should have downloaded here one of these two images and not the media writer. If you want to install it via dual boot, or you want to install this or use it as a live user, you can always use the media writer, but you should have downloaded one of these two files. 32-bit for 32-bit systems, 46-bit, 64-bit for 64-bit systems. You should also download the VirtualBox software. So you can already download VirtualBox at this moment. I don't know, there are some, okay, I can see it, there are Mac users. So you have VirtualBox both for Windows as for Mac users. You download the correct version. If you have a Windows computer, you download the Windows host. If you have a MacBook or something else, you download the OS X host. And after installation, you should all download the VirtualBox extension pack. This is for all systems the same file. May I recommend you that you have some administrator privileges on your computer. So if there are different accounts, an administrator account and a user account, please use the administrator account for the installation. And I hope that this is possible on all computers. Because if you are not an administrator on your account, you will have problems when installing the extension pack. It will lead to some problems during the rest of the installation. So have these rights if that is possible. Afterwards, after we install VirtualBox, after we install Fedora, Linux will be the same on every computer. So if you have a Mac or a Windows computer, this will all be the same. So you can all perform the same exercises. So already try to download VirtualBox, install VirtualBox, and install the extension pack. General overview, so we have the PowerPoint presentations, the syllabus as indicated here. The examination will account for 100% of the exam, so there are no tasks for or no assignments for this course unit. If you would like to have some kind of extra information, there is a nice, it's in Dutch, textbook available called Aan de slag met Linux voor LPIC 1, which you can of course buy, but it is extra information. So it's much more than we see during this course unit. It's actually for becoming a Linux system administrator with a lot of information available. But if you want to know more about Linux, this is actually some good book to have a look at. It discusses two distributions, so CentOS with Red Hat and Fedora, and also Ubuntu distributions. So there are some different flavors in Linux, and both most important flavors being Fedora and Ubuntu are discussed here. What should you be able to do during the exam? There are two parts during the exam. We have a part without using the course material and one part while using the course material. Without using the course material, you should be able to use and apply all basic commands that we see during the presentations. You should know what they do. You should be able to give the right command if I ask you a question. I want to perform this exercise. How do you solve that? And also explain all the terms and concepts that are used during this presentation. If I ask you what is Linux, you should be able to give me a definition of Linux. If I ask you what is Unix or what is the difference between Linux and Unix, you should also be able to answer that. So there are some concepts, for instance, the distribution and so on, that are discussed and that you also should be able to answer. While accessing the course material, you can use all course material. You should be able to make an extensive exercise, and this is mostly for the last part. So for the chapter 8 is the bash scripting. You can use all the commands that you saw in the other chapters, and you can use your course material to solve an exercise that will mainly be writing a script. So in this case, you can actually use your course material. We have some very specific laptop requirements, computer requirements for this course unit, but also for the whole program. So normally, during your enrollment, it was stated that there was some laptop requirements, should be sufficient enough, should have enough power, enough memory, and so on. And this is, of course, the case. This is the case for mainly course units like, for example, high throughput analysis. So in high throughput analysis, you really need this powerful computer to analyze the data and to be able to work with your computer during these lectures. For Linux, this is a little bit less. So what do we require? This is for a clean installation of Linux, so we won't perform a clean installation, but you should have a minimum of 4 GB of memory available, so 4 GB RAM, 20 GB disk space, and an internet connection. So this is very limited. Because we are installing Linux as a virtual machine, you of course have to share your memory, you have to share your disk space, you have to share your processor cores, and so on between your host system, Windows or Mac, and between Linux. And that's why we need a little bit more. If you have only 4 GB and you have to share between Linux and Windows, there's not enough memory available to run both programs at the same time. There is a possibility to install Linux via dual boot, which means once you start up your computer, you get the opportunity to choose to boot into Linux or to boot into Windows. The installation is also discussed on the core side, but you're not obliged to do so. So we start with the installation as a virtual machine. If you have problems with this virtual machine, it's too slow, it's not working well, then you can try to install Linux as dual boot. This is a possibility, just to know that if you have problems, you can have an extra option to solve these.
Recommend it anyway, or
it's much faster.
Yeah.
So installing Linux dual boot is much faster than installing Linux as a virtual machine. The only problem is that today we are going to look at the instructions on how to install, and can do it at the same time with one computer. If you want to install it dual boot, you cannot look at your computer with the instructions and install it at the same time. So you always need a second computer with some information concerning the installation. But if you like, you can definitely try to install it dual boot. I can recommend that. And you can also choose to install Linux on your computer and run Windows as a virtual machine. This is also possible. So there are different possibilities for this installation. Where does Linux come from? A time back, let's say 40, 50 years back, computers weren't as accessible as they are today. So they were not as small as they are today. Today, this is our computer, this is a laptop, this is small, this is scalable, we can take it everywhere, it has enough power. But in the beginning of the computer era, this wasn't the case. So if you looked at computers, they were as big as a house, maybe a small house, or as big as a room. This was a computer. And there weren't that many computers available, so the big research institutes had their own computers, and they developed their own operating system for these computers. The problem was, if you performed an experiment on one computer, you created some software, and you would like to install the software on another computer that had a different operating system, it was very hard to get that software running on a different computer. So there were some problems with compatibility. I could perform an exercise on one computer, could perform it on the other, but I could not exchange the software or any other tools and so on. Therefore, in the 1960s, there was a response by the AT&T Bell Labs, and they created a new operating system. And this new operating system was the solution for this compatibility, allowed to install this operating system on all computers that were available, and every computer had the same operating system. In this way, we could create software and run it on all the different computers that were available. This new operating system was very simple, elegant, written in C language, and so on and so on. The code that was used was very accessible to recycle, but there were some problems with that. We called this new operating system Unix. That's why we not only talk about Linux, but we also talk about Unix. But the problem with that is that this new operating system was very expensive. You had to pay for it. And as you know, when we install Fedora, Fedora is a Linux distribution, you don't have to pay for that. It's open source, it's freely available. You can change the code, you can copy the code, you can make your own version of it if you want to, so it is freely available. And Unix was not. It was very expensive and it was very slow. And of course, because there was a compatible operating system, there was a response, and this was the GNU movement. And the GNU movement, GNU stands for GNU, not Unix, so they use their own abbreviation in the explanation of the abbreviation, stands for offering a free version of this Unix operating system. So they created an open source, which means that you could use the code, you can adjust the code, it's free to use, and so on and so on. These are the other principles, and they created this kind of open source operating system so that you could use and install on your computer. The GNU movement was also the basis for one of the most important open source licenses. If you download VirtualBox and you look at the license agreement of VirtualBox, you will see that this is also published under the GPL, General Public License. So this is one of the most important open source licenses that was created. The problem was we had this operating system, but the kernel, so the heart of the operating system, was still missing and should be written separately for every computer. And then, in 1991, we had a student, a Finnish student, Linus Torvalds, and Linus Torvalds developed the first open source kernel, so the heart of the operating system, for this Unix-based open source operating system. And that's why we call our operating system today Linux, because it was developed by Linus Torvalds. What can we see in this kernel? So this is the heart of our operating system, is the layer between what we have as a user interface. This can be a command prompt, this can be a virtual environment or a graphical environment, and the hardware, so the actual hardware of our computer. So this is the kernel. If we have drivers that are used to operate our hardware, this also belongs to the kernel. And then we can add, of course, extra types of software to our kernel to expand it into a whole operating system, to give it its own flavor, and so on and so on. And that's also why there are a lot of different distributions available, because you can flavor it as you would like. Where can we use Linux? We can use Linux almost everywhere. So there is a lot of hardware available. Being old and exotic hardware that can run Linux, you don't actually need that much power of your system, and you can already run Linux. You can have it as a workstation. This is what we are using, so we are using the workstation. We also have servers, mid-range and high-end servers that run Linux. A lot of the very powerful and very popular servers that are used today, web servers for instance, are Linux servers, and also a lot of important hardware and software companies use Linux for their system. Also a lot of governments actually use Linux as basic operating system because they don't want to pay for example, Windows or a Mac operating system. So we can use it as a server, we can use it on mobile equipment. If you think about Android, Android is actually based on Linux, so it's some kind of Linux version. You can also use it as a desktop, which is less successful because of the development of Windows with its graphical user face and so on. Today, if we look at Linux with its desktop, it also has a graphical user interface. But in the beginning, the user interface was not available, and Windows had the user interface, and that's why Windows is a little bit more popular. And you can also embed it, so if you look at traffic lights, if you look at coffee machines, if you look at GPSs, they can all contain Linux software. Who can use them? It's used a lot by programmers because there are some compilers available, libraries, development tools. The programming languages are already installed in most of the Linux distributions. But also for us, for bioinformatics, we can install databases, we can install bioinformatics tools, we can install programming languages that we use, and so on. Very simple in this Linux environment. So we can use it for that. How far can you go? You can go as far as you would like. I don't know if you know what RTFM stands for. Read the fucking manual. Sorry for that. So you can go as far as you want. So you can keep on reading, keep on developing, develop your own version, and so on. So there is actually the possibility to develop your own Linux version. I provide you with the link, so you can have a look at that. If you have some time to spare, you can actually have a look at developing your own Linux version. If we expand our kernel into a general operating system, we call this a distribution. There are a lot of distributions available. This has a shell, so the shell is the user interface that we have, the graphical utilities, the different command line utilities that are available, and so on. So in a Linux distribution, it's always the same. Linux kernel. expanded with the GNU operating system, so based on the GNU movement, and some additional applications. We have a lot of GNU tools available, for instance GNOME, and GNOME is an example of the desktop environment that we use here in Linux. Which type of distribution do we use? You already know it, you already downloaded it. We chose to use Fedora. So here you have the most popular distribution based on the number of users that actually use the Linux distribution. Number one is Ubuntu. Until I think it's 4 years back, we also installed Ubuntu, but with our new educational program, and also because we have a number of guest lecturers in our educational program, we had a survey and all of our guest lecturers were actually using Fedora instead of Ubuntu. And that's why we are also today using Fedora. You should know that the commands that we learn for Fedora also work in an Ubuntu or a SUSE or a CentOS operating system. So they are all the same. There are some minor deviations. So there are some very minor deviations, but most of the commands are the same between all different flavors of this operating system. So that's why we are using Fedora. If we look at the possibilities, there are a lot of possibilities for the installation. I already gave you an introduction to the installation of Fedora. So it is possible to delete Windows from your computer or from your MacBook, delete your OS X system, and have a clean installation of Linux. So this is a possibility. Just install Linux as the first operating system on your computer. It is also possible to have a look at your hard drive and to create a separate partition. So you can free up disk space on your hard drive using a disk partitioning utility and install Linux on that partition. If you would like to combine this, so the installation on a separate hard drive partition between Windows, it is important that you first install Windows and next install Linux on your system. Or else you will have problems during boot to have this boot menu available. If you don't understand what I'm saying, it's no problem. Next, you can also choose to run Linux as a virtual machine, which is actually the most simple way to install Linux, and this is also the way that we will discuss. Just remember, if you have problems with running Linux as a virtual machine, it doesn't work for your computer, try the second installation possibility. So there are some guidelines on the course site that explain how to perform this installation, and you should actually have a look at this possibility to install Linux via dual boot. So that you have the possibility to boot into Windows or to boot into Mac or to boot into Linux when starting up your computer. Just have a look at that. What do we need? A virtual machine. We chose for VirtualBox, but there are also other virtualization techniques available. And of course we need the image. It's an ISO image of Fedora Workstation to perform this installation. Okay. And then I think we can start with the demo. Is everybody ready?